Hi, I'm Judy. Welcome to Go with Yin Yoga. Right now, you're going to see a link to a practice that I filmed in conjunction with this little vlog about variations of saddle pose. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I didn't want to take up your time during that little, I'm calling it a mini masterclass, was about why we don't warm up for this. Now, if you're very familiar with Yin Yoga, you probably know we don't warm up for Yin Yoga. In fact, a lot of people really like to do Yin Yoga first thing in the morning when their body hasn't been moving. I like to do that. I do some Yin Yoga in bed pretty much every single morning. But we don't warm up for Yin Yoga poses because we're not trying to work our muscles at all. We're going to get some work. It's not restorative yoga where we're supposed to completely be propped and completely let go. There is a big difference between restorative and yin, even though they seem very similar. But we want our muscles to not be warm so that we don't go too deeply into a pose and potentially injure ourselves. I talk a lot about how saddle pose is often not accessible for a lot of bodies. That was the other thing I mentioned, that I might have something else to talk about. So quite a few years ago, if you had asked me, do I do saddle pose? I would say no, I don't do it. It doesn't feel right in my body. It just didn't. And people say, oh, but you need this. It's so great for this. It's so great for that. And so eventually I said, okay, let me try it. And after a while, I got to the point where I could easily, well, maybe not easily, but I could be like this and holding on to and come all the way down like this and stay there for a while. I'm not going to stay there because I've just spent almost an hour filming saddle pose. But it took some work for my body. It really took some work. I never injured myself. But it wasn't a pose that came naturally to me. I don't know, somewhere along the way, I stopped practicing it as well. I can't say as I really miss it. Anyway, but it wasn't an easy pose for me. It might be for you. If you're very hypermobile, it might feel really good to you, and then you have to be very cautious when you're hypermobile, which means you're like double jointed and you're very flexible. It's really, you don't feel as much sensation when you are stretching. So you stretch and you stretch and you stretch. And often you end up injuring yourself because you've gone way past your edge because you just don't feel the sensation. Okay, that was a little side note. So we don't warm up for our poses. And that's also why we hold poses longer in Yin Yoga. So we're basically kind of building a warm-up into our pose. Not exactly, but we come into a pose. We don't go as deep as we're capable of right away, maybe 50%. Maybe if you're one of those hypermobile people, maybe only about 30%. And you start there. And we're holding the pose for 3 minutes. And we do hold in stillness, but you can go deeper and deeper into the pose if that feels like the right thing for you to do on that particular day. So we don't warm up. I mean, saddle pose can easily be a peak pose in a hatha yoga practice. We don't warm up, so we don't overstretch, because it can happen and you can injure yourself. But we hold longer so that we can begin to let time and gravity begin to open those ligaments and joints and get deep, deep into our connective tissue, which tends to be super tight on most people, myself included. So anyway, those are a few little thoughts that I didn't put into that little mini masterclass. I also have a couple of questions if you happen to do that practice. I have been for quite a few years now breaking down different poses, giving variations, because I feel that most bodies can do most poses, maybe not all poses, but they may need to use some props. They may need to take a totally different pose that targets the same areas. And so I like to give a lot of variations because we're all different. Our anatomy is different. Our bones are different. They're longer, they're shorter, they're turned in, they're all sorts of different angles, all sorts of differences. We're all unique. We're all an experiment of one. So anyway, my question to you, do you find these useful? Right about now, hopefully, the playlist of all these different breakdowns for a lot of different poses, I think we're up to about maybe 20 at the moment, should pop up on the screen. Maybe you want to explore that. I also want to ask you, if you found that important, would you like to have a little ebook so that you could have something written? I might not do, I'm not going to do all the variations. I mean, that would be a book. But I could link to all the pose breakdowns I've done so far. I could talk about where you're targeting. I can make it kind of quick. And then I could link in it to practices that use that particular pose. And one thing I will tell you, I don't think there are any practices on my channel, and I have several hundred, that use saddle pose. Maybe there was one in the very beginning. I just feel that can be a pose that is difficult for a lot of people, myself included when I began. And I can't see you, and I can't suggest props or variations. So I just don't put into my practices. I think I mentioned this in the previous video, but alternatives are dragon pose. I think that's kind of, but you know, you're certainly getting into those quads. Sphinx, I do mention that. Sphinx, pulling one heel in towards your glutes. That's one of my favorite poses. I really like that pose. And bridge, actually. It's also a kind of but supported bridge. I'm talking about supported bridge. You're certainly, again, getting into your quads. Okay, so drop me a comment below if you'd like a little ebook on these pose breakdowns and links to various practices that use them. If that's something that's of interest of you, I really want to hear from you. Anything else you want to say? Any questions you may have for me? And thank you very much for tuning in. And I hope that you found something in my links or in this talk that was new to you and made a lot of sense about why we're not warming up before doing poses in Yin Yoga.